think I've made a recording like this before where I've interjected and commented on a debate or an argument or a discussion between two people. I'm pretty sure I've made one of these recordings before regarding rationality rules. It's so cringe to always watch things that he's involved with. I've often actually left long comments, and they always have the same style of critique because it's always the same sophistry and pseudo-intellectualism. It's actually quite. I'll probably read out what I wrote under this particular discussion before I even watched it, which I guess you could call it proof of my prejudice. But once you've seen one train wreck, you've seen them all, as it were. Wow. Actually, it would springboard me better to just read it, because it'll help me frame, I guess, what I'm about to describe and structure as this ongoing, perennial, embarrassing form of sophistry, which rationality rules. He pervades his own subjective categorization of issues. So I mean, like, I'm watching him take STEFAN MOLYNEUX to task for essentially. I mean, to some degree, STEFAN, he did say all the right things, but in some sense, the intellectual dishonesty of rationality rules didn't force the proper confrontation, and so it's sort of, the whole thing devolves into a kind of a shit show. But I'm at like 65%, I guess. Or no, I'm like, yeah, around 65%, where I paused it to start making this recording, because it's so. I imagine that it's not going to get much better than this. I think I've probably seen the heart of the intellectual cross purpose that's gone on. So let me describe at least my reduction of where the disagreement is. I'm not going to give a summary of the whole thing. I'm just going to give a summary of where I see the cross purpose, or how they're missing each other. So it's all, in some sense, rationality rules' private chairmanship of the intellectual matter, in some sense, where he hasn't. He doesn't have the intellectual humility to make the point that he's making vulnerable and susceptible to criticism, because he leverages it from this kind of murky and veiled, sort of privileged default idea of superiority, and that he already contends the default position and the kind of the orthodoxy, and that other people have to sort of survive his specious interpretation, of essentially he pits people to defend against his, like, somehow automatically superior categorization of these things. So in some sense, right from the start, STEFAN MOLYNEUX was not interested in the categorical imperative, and he in some sense he didn't debunk it, but he voiced serious doubts about it. And in some sense, um, you know, that's the intellectual ground where there's a gap between these two thinkers, is that someone thinks that the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative is an important distinction in philosophy, and in some sense, STEFAN MOLYNEUX, in some sense, believes that in some sense there are only hypothetical imperatives. I mean, I don't want to put words in his mouth. I don't know how he's going to exactly mount, but I mean, that's what they're sort of dancing around. And in some sense, STEFAN MOLYNEUX did suggest something like that. And instead of respecting that difference of opinion, or that and forcing that particular confrontation, rationality rules continues to try to hit STEFAN MOLYNEUX over the head with the fact that he hasn't derived something that has the same hypothetical broadness as the categorical imperative, which is ironic, because in some sense the categorical imperative is categorical in each and every instance, because it hypothetically pertains to a kind of to conceptualization itself. And Stefan Molyneux, in his particular treatment of his, construct of UPB, has somewhat fashioned a mounting of solving that problem. And this isn't good enough for rationality rules, because rationality rules need something to look exactly like the categorical imperative, with Stefan Molyneux in some sense already disparaged. But he just sort of steamrolls over that, and rationality rules has a sacred cow that needs worship, that needs to be sacrificed to, and the distinction between what falls short of that sacred cow is what rationality rules continues to sort of privately or subjectively, in his sanctimonious, sort of abrogation of his intellectual superiority, and his, in somehow he is a representative of the veiled matrix of truth, and the representative and spokesperson of the objective truth, and as its representative, because he has the sentimentality that the distinction between the categorical imperative and the hypothetical imperative is a keen distinction that is an overriding conceptual, in terms, he is just sort of, he just exudes that moral authority, or sorry, that intellectual piece of intellectual superiority. And I mean, this is generally how rationality rules functions. It's quite ironic, because it's often in a piece, he's actually, it's almost like a paradox, because he's always sort of hypocritically representing the thing that he's accusing the other person of falling foul of. I'm going to read out. Yeah, I mean, some of that could have been slightly more detailed, but let me just read my comment, just because. And I wrote this comment before I listened to. Actually, I'll just read the comment. I haven't watched this yet, and I really don't want to, because even listening to Rationality Rules disgusts me with how self-deluded and unreasonable someone can be, and yet still be invited to discuss anything with anyone. Semicolon. I already thought this would be a shit show, and just having skimmed some of the comments, I will describe why and how I anticipate this will be a low-quality exchange. M-. Mainly because of the low-quality rationalistic cultism that Rationality Rules traffics in. He is little more than a sophist who seizes the default high ground of authoritative orthodoxy and expects his opponents to counter his directive dictates of skeptical and cherry-picked, pre-filtered, pre-interpreted, aligned, rationalized reality, projected from a veiled matrix of objective truth, which he bestows onto himself the true believer status of being the spokesperson thereto. He is the mysterious son of the mystical god of logic, you see. This style of sophistry is akin to those other forms of skeptical debasements. They don't hold a substantive position, they hold the agnostic, neutral, non-claim. So, in the style of all pseudo-intellectual charlatans, the philosophical stance functions by selectively, in brackets, and immaturely, speciously bestowing intellectual charity depending on his preordained sentiments. He is basically a cerebral variant of histrionic personality disorders, of a histrionic personality disordered individual. And his effort into emulate, skipped a line. And his choice as to which pieces of reason are worth interpreting into a context which makes sense, and those with which he won't deign to put any cognitive effort into emulating, is based on how he chooses to divine the cold, hard array of objective reality, which his subjective tether to the veiled matrix of truth allows him to innately survey and intuit by a totemic collection of table-thumped rational or logical assumptions, which serve as holy relics to ground his shoddy worldview of blind faith scientism. Okay, you must remember that this is not, I'm anticipating his style of pseudo-intellectualism, so I don't exactly know what he's going to go into, but anyway. Discussing any topic with this kind of cerebral, vulnerable narcissist is itself the mistake, as all he is effectively doing is table-thumping his chairmanship of the epistemological narrative. He doesn't even have the conceptual resources to deconstruct his own pseudo-intellectualism, because he has elected logic to be his personal divinity, and although it may be veiled and mysterious, his heuristic reductions are sacrosanct and beyond reproach. Treat with care, he is the chosen one. Semicolon. Stefan, you are wasting your time. This kind of pseudo-intellectual is better left to their vacuous and hollow secondary intellectual economies of mutual assurance. You know, the village atheist sort of intellects, so that they can fashion their little tree houses and elevate themselves to feeling, okay, this is a typo, feelings of superiority with their dark arts of fabricated interpretation of the intellectual realm. Okay, that gets a bit vague at the end there, but let me specialize it now within this context. I mean, you can tell that this whole thing really eroded quite badly when they reached the topic of okay, yeah. So you can see how Rationality Rules sets up his trap and veils his private commitments, which aren't made intellectually vulnerable to in the discussion when he is extracting a kind of agreement. So he says. So he says language itself. If someone says that language must have meaning, is that UPB? Now, and this is when STEFAN MOLYNEUX, sort of falls into the trap, as it were. Or I mean, he can't know that he's fallen into this intellectually dishonest trap until after he's triggered it, and Rationality Rules, sort of makes this very feeble intellectual, sort of point that this confirms his case against and his claim against STEFAN MOLYNEUX's, sort of thinking, is that STEFAN MOLYNEUX says, well, it's kind of like two things. And in some sense, that's because there's the UPB in practice, and then there's the UPB as a kind of pure mental construct. Like if you can be, let's say, if you can be objective about philosophy itself, can you entertain an idea without being already a user of the idea? Can you impassionately sort of think about it? And in some sense, UPB in some sense is a form of rationality that is almost, I guess, perhaps, I mean, I'm just going to be a bit vague, and this, now what I'm going to say is perhaps not so useful because it can be picked apart quite badly, but it's something, I mean, perhaps it's meant to sort of function as a kind of secular religion in some sense, in terms of providing the kind of a heart of morality, or a lifeblood of morality, or a kind of or the spirit of a moral system in some sense, and in some sense it doesn't. It can be made into two things. It can be made into an activity, and it can be made into a purely conceptual thing that you, in some sense, could only purely objectify in a conceptual form if there was an alternative to it. So, in some sense, if you want to make the claim that essentially it's not categorical, you have to prove that there's an alternative to it, in some sense, and that essentially is how STEFAN MOLYNEUX sort of doesn't even fall into that dichotomy, is because and why he uses essentially the form of the hypothetical imperative every time he talks about it, because the idea is that, well, what else are you going to do? There's nothing else to there's no other contemplative thing, and even if you did have something that was that had the bifurcation of a categorical sort of schema in some sense, and that as a subset within it could support hypothetical imperatives, I guess, the Kantian sort of system, which he has already thrown shade on, which he has expressed his disdain for it. In some sense, how would you even know that the categorical imperative truly wasn't just a kind of overarching thematic. I mean, how could it ever be evidenced in some sense? Um, I mean, how could it ever be expressed other than at the same time through some form of hypothetical imperative? Um, so, in some sense, the hypothetical imperative is a necessary condition for the categorical imperative anyway. So, in some sense, rationality has to establish something about categorical imperatives, other than just merely assuming that essentially hypothetical pertains to is, and categorical is the only thing that pertains to ought. I mean, he's just sort of arbitrarily made that conceptual distinction that he's somehow just inherited from the authority of the Kantian, I don't know, canon somehow. And essentially because he represents that canonical view, then he can sort of trap anyone he wants in his subjective spider web in some sense, and essentially deploy it on them at will, and without establishing it, without making a positive argument first. I mean, it's and in some sense just assuming that he already has the default. So I mean, talking as a third wheel outside, sort of would-be interlocutor, as a third wheel interlocutor, it's hard for me to fully critique this because in some sense, I wouldn't be as brash if I was part of the conversation. I would interject as an inquisitorial open. I would phrase it as an open question that that essentially there's a gap between you two, and you are actually rationality rules. It is on you essentially to extend a positive substantive argument in this case. You can't merely just inflect it, or rather invert the obligation of what you surmise already is that you hold the distinctive chairmanship of imposing a conceptual distinction, which you haven't even, in some sense, this is the kind of sophistry that leftists always do, or I shouldn't say leftists. I mean, I still consider myself a Marxist, but is the so-called liberal progressive left, which, to my mind, they're all just fascists anyway and vulnerable narcissists. But this is the same trick, or scientism has actually also, actually, Rationality Rules has been on YouTube for a long time. He has been a promulgator of this kind of pseudo-intellectualism, where essentially you hold the high ground, and then you just kind of impose these obligations almost suggestively, and you project them as failings onto your interlocutor, and then as they don't perform by sort of perfectly sort of jumping over these obstacles and these hurdles, which you throw at them at your privileged self-elected position of essentially being the arbiter of this intellectual domain that you have just sort of incepted the interlocutor into. And then essentially because they can't perfectly jump these vague hurdles, these nebulous hurdles, which you're sort of projecting onto them by your sort of your shadowy implication of not having substantiated a positive claim, and this is why I do think it's intellectual dishonesty, because this is generally what skepticism functions through. This is the lifeblood of the pseudo-intellectual skeptic, is that they just assume that they're not making positive arguments, that they're not making positive claims, that somehow they are just sort of they've inherited their neutral centrism, that somehow yeah, okay, well, I guess perhaps I've exhausted all my points now, perhaps expressed slightly embarrassingly, but I mean that's the key substantive issues here that have been, I would, in my view, completely transgressed. Is essentially the whole difference is that Rationality Rules makes this vague sort of question. Okay, well, the claim that language has meaning, if someone admits to that, are they already doing UPB? It's like, well, what is the context? So they already try to decouple it. They're already asking a fundamentally ambiguous question, because they're saying, like, if someone makes the statement, uh, language has meaning. If someone commits to that, are they already doing UPB? I mean, it's like, as if the concept itself can be decoupled from an overarching context of what the individual is thinking. That somehow that concept, by that phrase, that claim by itself, well, I mean, they might hold other claims that are contradictory. So like that would essentially, um, you know, the problem is that essentially context doesn't just become bounded in its own sort of, in those quantized, sort of packets of or language. If I commit that language does have meaning, am I already doing UPB? It's a fundamentally vague and nebulous question, and it's that the ambiguousness built into it in some sense, which is what elicited um, STEFAN Molyneux to sort of say, okay, well, it's sort of, it's two things in some sense, like it's and so STEFAN Molyneux could make the claim, which I think almost resolves this issue by saying, well, if you say that, it's not UPB. So in some sense, it's like he can't confirm that it is UPB, but it's at least from that alone, you can't. It is not the invalidation of UPB. It is, at least so far, perhaps it seems commensurate with UPB, and in some sense, like the the function of an example itself is that it's a single depiction. So if you want to ask about the concept itself and not about the deployment of the concept or the use of the concept or the actual utilization or culture, I mean, that's the thing, is that UPB in some sense is something like a in some sense, rationality rules is really turning on this really stupid distinction, which is not relevant to what they're talking about. He's making he's pretending to make a very fine and nuanced, sort of distinction in which the categorical imperative um, is sort of is held in some great special regard in some sense, which, if you want to, I mean, in some sense, that already sort of came up in the conversation, and it was left unattended. It was sort of glossed over. Um, but okay, I could make greater claims which are more about, in some sense, psychology and conceptualization in general. But I mean, in some sense, this trumped up, sort of distinction, which is not relevant in this circumstance at all. I mean, it's ironic in some sense, because that if you make the expression of any categorical imperative as it's instantiated in reality must also manifest or present itself via the conduit of a hypothetical imperative. Categorical imperatives do not have an instantiated existence um, beyond specific or particular hypothetical imperatives heralding them in some sense. And so, what does that categorical imperative, in the sense in which rationality rules is trying to depend on it for, how does that even exist? Where does it even exist? It exists and pertains only to a hypothetical sort of moral agent, in some sense, to any and all moral agents, in some sense. But to the extent to which all moral agents must also, at the same time of employing the categorical imperative, also be manifesting some hypothetical imperative as the conduit of that categorical imperative. The distinction that he's trying to make It's funny because the thing that he says about equivocation, in some sense, he's doing a version of that himself on a conceptual level. That he's made a distinction, um, uh, or he's done it in. No, I guess I'm just trying to think what the inverse of an equivocating fallacy is. But it's almost like a disambiguating fallacy in some sense. He's trying to rest this on an academic distinction, which is utterly, um, I mean, to the extent to which that he hasn't thought this through. It just shows the level to which he's not interested in thinking about these things in terms of good faith. He's not interested in sort of conceptually animating what's actually going on. If he can just find a kind of a technical distinction to cry foul about, that's as far as he goes. And essentially, as long as he's created these mechanisms, and of which there are, many sort of rational mechanisms, and then he can just, almost in a histrionic fashion, he can just he can read things and plug them into these mental devices in some sense, and he'll just keep on doing it until he can force a failure in some sense. Um, and he doesn't recheck it in terms of cogency. He doesn't parse it, PARSE, in terms of any kind of, because the actual, you do need a certain level of charity in order to have a discussion. Um, and you can see that fail quite clearly when he tries to sort of clamp his very specious point, which is someone doing UPB, um, is someone doing UPB when they say language has meaning, and essentially the equivoc that should, in some sense, the intelligent way to get out of that. Stefan Molyneux, in some sense, fell into the trap quite badly. Um, I was anticipating it, but perhaps it's because I can already read what's wrong with the intellectualism of rationality rules, and I'm already familiar with that to some degree, in some sense. But essentially, what Stefan Molyneux should have said is, I can't answer that question. It doesn't have an answer. I need to know I need to know the context. The context is not fully indicated, so I don't know the answer, is actually the answer to the question. So you could have removed the forced equivocation or the forced ambiguity by simply just retreating to in some sense, like, the context does not indicate, or like, I need, the example doesn't have enough of a context. And this sort of pre-selective emulation of what the context involves and what the context doesn't involve, that's the kind of intellectual dishonesty that I'm talking about. That's the kind of sort of emulating things in such a way as towards the right sort of rational mechanism in order to force a kind of conceptual error, based on some very brittle academic distinction that, in some sense, has a substantive component which is not being addressed, because if it was, it would fall so quickly. It's too simple. But again, rationality rules won't make the positive substantive argument first. He won't do it in the light. He'll just do it sort of as this veiled matrix of assumed authority, in some sense, of assumed intellectual. That obviously, because you're not formulating something that can be, and why would one want to form a categorical imperative? Because if one even did, it wouldn't you know it wouldn't solve the I mean, it's even in the word itself, universally preferred behavior. I must say, I think I'm critical of universal. There's probably something about this philosophy um, that that I think is problematic for other reasons, but I'm not going to go into my particular argument. It just and I'd have to develop that. But I mean, yeah, the whole thing about the murder as well. I mean, that was a red herring, to say the least. I mean, the unlawfulness aspect, really, which Stefan did bring up. Okay, sorry, let me just think if there's anything else to add to this. And maybe I'll outline what I think that my general disquiet is, although I haven't developed an argument against it. But in some sense, I'm a non-realist, so I guess I'm just in a different camp completely. So or an anti-realist. I don't know what they call them. There was another point that I could bring up. Yeah, so I mean, in some sense, Stefan Molyneux should have probably made a sort of taken it to the absurd to refute this very facile point that Rationality Rules is bringing up, which is that can one will anything or do anything as a moral agent that does not, in effect, occur through the conduit of a hypothetical imperative? And so, if you have a standard which pervades all hypothetical imperatives, then in some sense it has a categorical purview, even if it's not within itself defined or understood by its own conceptual description, form of descriptiveness. It does not conform to the definition of a categorical imperative. But who is imposing that as a standard? You have to make a positive claim as to why that is why that is a preferable standard in some sense. So in some sense, what we have Rationality Rules doing is saying the concept of should and the concept of hypothetical imperatives are distinctly different. I haven't made an argument to prove why. I mean, obviously they are different in some sense, but he hasn't said why that difference is pertinent at all in his argument against Stefan. He's just sort of he intimates it, he implies it, but he doesn't make a positive claim about it. And I mean, this oversight, I mean, to me, this is how sophistry functions. This is how it happens. It's a form of misdirection. It's sort of, it does this very embarrassing sort of thing, and then it just sort of, it inverts the evidentiary burden. And then essentially, as it makes the other person look foolish, they take this as confirmation of their mastery, and it's disgusting. It really is disgusting. Anyway, okay, that's the end. Okay, I'll just make the small addendum because I kind of intimated to it, and this links to my other psychological sort of things where I get into. But I mean, this is an example of cerebral, what I would generally categorize as some form of cerebral histrionic, sort of mechanism, which and essentially is you relay interpretation within a spectrum of acceptable, sort of. It has to do with my example of the clouds. So it's the the subset, the many clouds, the micro clouds that are attached to a kind of veiled matrix within the ego function, and because they and so the veiled truth that has this invisible matrix and creates this kind of invisible umbrella of sort of equally possible alternative interpretations and alternative models and things like that that might be in some kind of subjective internal preference, but that gives them at least the many intellectual faces with which to relay communication with. So when they're in communication with someone and they're getting an argument, they have multiple interpretations which they permit themselves to apply to what they're receiving on their input. So they can essentially guard themselves against having to give a cohesive treatment of something and a cogent treatment of something. So essentially, they have a very fragmented way of judging things. They have a very technical kind of brittle way of deconstructing things conceptually. And this is necessary so that they can still believe that they have some level of internal sophistication in terms of intellectual matters. And they do this so that they can carve out some kind of specialization and some kind of so they can play some game of status seeking, between their subconscious and their ego function. And so I mean, anyway, so that's my general judgment of Rationality Rules, is that he's just essentially cerebral histrionic. So in as much as I give psychological commentary, that's and in some sense, I mean, he's not, he probably wouldn't accord to a histrionic diagnosis. In fact, people don't like even giving histrionic diagnoses because, in some sense, I think it is a growing popular view that, I mean, how I would conceive of it is that most people are histrionic to some degree, and it's really a kind of it's a level of maturity in some sense, or rather, it's a level of immaturity, and many people never develop from it. They just sort of they make it their home, and they make it their sort of their behavior, because it's more of a social activity. It's plugged into a particular subculture generally. It serves a kind of social function. It's like being trying to be the dominant spider in the collective spider web in some sense. So it's very entrenched within a wider context in some sense, and it's the general current of that context which allows them to shape their internal orchestration of affairs so that they can better gear themselves externally in some sense. And so it's trying to just be a kind of status-seeking shark in a pond sort of thing, and that's why they often have this quite almost corrosive, and this is why they often try to specialize in something that where it's easy to kind of abrogate some kind of cultural currency of authority. And in something in which it's easy to sort of disguise. You need harsh, crude distinctions that are easy to convolute in order to disguise this level of this cultural game, which continues to propound and function only because of a kind of general adherence of certain rules that allow for a kind of an intellectual fraud, of misdirection on a kind of wholesale, in a kind of secondary economy, a secondary intellectual economy. It's very similar to a whole lot of other social phenomena that you see. It's very similar to the kind of the talking heads on the mainstream media. It's just obviously histrionics. They try to do this in a more austere, they try to do it in something in which I mean, the sadistically edged kind of arena, is always a bit of a sort of a blood sport attached to it. Something that a kind of a competitive edge. I mean, well, that's the general atmosphere, because it's only in that kind of atmosphere that you're allowed to sort of traffic in the kind of intellectual bad faith that's needed in order to keep that kind of secondary economy functioning. Um, yeah, that was the connotation of like echo chambers and things like that. But anyway, oh wow, I really should do some research so that I can't, because essentially I'm forcing any detractors from what I'm about to say to sort of do some research and do some fact checking, because I'm basically I'm going to throw out this argument blindly, essentially, that I'm not going to check the factual basis of this, but just looking at what STEFAN Molyneux defines as an ambush from Rationality Rules, and just looking at that content as a standalone content, not knowing the history and not knowing how this issue was brought up before 1.5 years ago, which Rationality said that he brought it up 1.5 years ago in his video or whatever. But if STEFAN Molyneux is even slightly correct in what he says, is that essentially um, he wasn't making an argument that was begging the question. He was in some sense creating a title, a heading of argument. And in essence, I mean, it seems to me that Rationality Rules is really stupid. Like, he doesn't even understand, like basic things like unlawfulness, in terms of that really embarrassing point that he tried to make about murder and about being in a Nazi camp or something like that. I mean, it's frankly, it's disgusting how stupid that is. I mean, in terms of not understanding lawfulness in the context of what would mitigate something being definitionally ascribed as murder. Um, as just, it's not even create such a stupid thought experiment. But anyway, but you do actually want something as a title of a heading, as a heading, as a title of all your arguments. You do want something that functionally is a syllogism that begs the question. The question is that, was he actually trying to make an argument? You would think that people that like actually care about making substantive points, they're not, like if they appear to be begging the question and they've got supporting arguments for that thing, then in fact, I mean, the reason why it's useful to beg the question, or to seemingly beg the question on a technical level but not actually be begging the question, is because you're breaking up your subject matter into comparable subcomponents. You're saying this thing equates to that thing. These things are a tautology in essence, but they are named differently. So you've got a summary of subheadings. You've got a summary of topics, and then as you address those subcomponents and show how they interrelate in a more complicated system of philosophical, treatise and exploration and treatment, then essentially it doesn't go as supporting that basic syllogism. It goes into understanding the all the component parts. So in some sense, it's the exposition of a system. And so, it's begging the question, therefore, on a technical level, is irrelevant if it's not an actual, if that wasn't intended to be an argument, but it was intended to be, in some sense, a kind of a heading of a greater argument, or a thematic sort of, because I mean, in looking at, because when you break it down into component parts, then in some sense the begging the question so-called argument is not an actual argument, and the fact that it does beg the question is in some sense a useful supporting factor, because then you know that when you've got a consistent treatment of what those points internally break down into, and then you've got a more sophisticated treatment of because, you know, some things are complicated, and in some senses the only way to give proper treatment to complicated topics, because, you know, I mean, I can give examples in terms of psychology. It's not really that useful, but you know, that a lot of words are very similar and they apply to the same field, but essentially because words are different and they're not exactly the same, that you need to almost create these constructs where you appear to be creating syllogisms that beg the question, because that essentially gives you the ingredients in order to broaden your exploration of how it functions, how it can be understood, and how it relates to broader topics and things like that. And so you can essentially expand your reach because you've got this translation of your concept into a different worded construction that is the same, that amounts to the same subject. So again, I mean, this is, I mean, you know, again, like whenever I look at Rationality Rules doing anything supposedly intellectual, it disgusts me. It's embarrassing. It's cringe, you know, it's just, wow. You know, it's like, I just want to almost repeat the thing that I said in the thing that I wrote before I even watched this. That, you know, like, this is what happens when you give light and air to and opportunity, you know, like, just let him live in his little troll cave where he can be the echo chamber of all the other scientism people. You know, this is a level of intellectual dishonesty which is just, it can't but essentially just duplicate its own bullshit. I mean, I guess I'm just exasperating myself now, but okay, hopefully that'll be the last addendum. But it's just, you know, it's this kind of foolishness that when you engage with it, it just makes you look bad, because it's so aggressively dishonest and fraudulent, intellectually fraudulent. You know, the kind of the level of brittle, you know, it's like specious. This is what happens when you get this level of specious intellectual charity, where you can interpret something in the most, like, technically pure possible way of essentially trying to degrade something, you know. And you can see the vulnerable narcissism, you know, or that sadistically edged, you know, sort of emotional, sentimental rationalizing. I mean, it's uncomfortable. I mean, it's uncomfortable to watch because it's so vicious, and how it tries to disguise its own, you know, sort of vacuousness and its sort of decadent exposition, and you know, the kind of the technical joy that it takes in being able to interpret something as being so you know, substandard. You know, it's yeah, it's just ugly. You know, this is why whenever I see Rationality Rules in any kind of video YouTube, I just think, you know, what I'm about to see is going to be a hideous exposition of intellectual dishonesty. And I mean, I guess I can't confirm this because I don't actually, I haven't read this part of the book, but I would put money, I would bet that I'm right, I guess. But I guess that makes me look even worse. That makes me look even more prejudiced. But in some sense, I guess I've sold myself down the river to character as fate, and I've essentially already in my mind judged Rationality Rules and his well, I guess, you know, my whole psychological background predisposes me towards judging people's character, and sadly, personality theory, which is what I consider myself a self-expert in, you know, essentially makes me I can't help but essentially engage in this form of character assassination. But I mean, I would rather just avoid this. I'm only watching this because Stefan Molyneux is part of it, and as soon as I must say, I did write that. I promise you, I wrote that before I watched this video. I wrote that. I mean, that's all I can say. Um, yeah. Let me see if this shit show goes in any other direction.